The billionaire's baby cried nonstop on the plane, until a poor elderly black woman did the unthinkable. "For God's sake, do something with that child," shouted the blonde first-class passenger, covering her ears with her manicured hands. The baby's shrill crying had been piercing the cabin for 3 hours straight, turning the first-class flight into an auditory nightmare. Richard Pemberton, a tech mogul and owner of a $2 billion fortune, held his 6-month-old son with visible despair. Lucas cried with such intensity that the aircraft windows vibrated, his little face red with tears and sweat. "Mr. Pemberton," the flight attendant whispered for the 7th time, "maybe we could try another bottle." "We've tried everything." Richard exploded, his voice laden with frustration and shame. The man who led meetings with multinational CEOs was completely lost when it came to his own son. Clean diaper, bottle, pacifier, music, nothing works. The other first-class passengers no longer hid their discontent. Exaggerated sighs, snide comments, and disapproving glances rained down on the businessman who, for the first time in his life, was unable to solve a problem with money or authority. From the back of the aircraft, in the last row of economy class, Dorothy Washington watched the situation with experienced eyes. At 72, the gray-haired black woman knew that kind of crying better than any pediatrician. She had raised 7 children, helped care for 16 grandchildren, and worked for decades as a nanny for wealthy families in Manhattan. Her calloused hands held an old magazine as she listened intently to the sounds coming from first class. It wasn't just crying from hunger or sleep. It was something more specific, more urgent. Dorothy knew exactly what to do. "Excuse me," she said softly, rising from her seat and walking down the aisle toward the curtain separating the classes. The flight attendant blocked her path with a polite but firm smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, this is a restricted area. Economy class passengers are not allowed." "That baby has colic," Dorothy interrupted politely but firmly. "I can help." "Thank you for your concern, but we have everything under control," lied the employee, clearly embarrassed by the chaos that had broken out in first class. Dorothy looked past him, seeing Richard rocking his son desperately while other passengers made increasingly hostile comments. She recognized that mixture of paternal despair and wounded pride. How many times had she witnessed this same scene in the homes where she had worked? "Listen, young man," she said to the flight attendant, her voice taking on a tone that brooked no argument. "I've been in this world for 72 years. I've raised more children than all of you put together and calmed more crying babies than there are seats on this plane. That child needs help, not protocol." For a moment, something in Dorothy's serene gaze made the employee hesitate. There was a natural authority about her that transcended social classes or corporate protocols. It was the wisdom of someone who had weathered storms that others could not even imagine. But before he could respond, Richard's angry voice echoed through the cabin. "Where the hell are the experts on this plane? I pay thousands of dollars for this ticket, and you can't even stop a baby from crying." Dorothy smiled discreetly. If this story of prejudice, wisdom, and an unexpected twist that would change lives forever has piqued your curiosity, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple economy class lady was about to teach the whole world that true wealth has no price tag or address. "Look here, ma'am," the flight attendant said with a condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We appreciate your intention, but we have trained professionals handling the situation. Please return to your seat." Dorothy watched over his shoulder as the chaotic scene unfolded in first class. Richard held Lucas as if he were carrying a bomb about to explode, while the blonde passenger gestured theatrically to other equally irritated passengers. "Trained professionals," Dorothy repeated softly, arching a gray eyebrow. "Young man, I took care of babies before you were born. This boy has severe colic, and every minute that passes only makes the situation worse." "Ma'am, with all due respect," the employee insisted, physically blocking her passage, "you can't just barge into first class. There are protocols." At that moment, the hysterical voice of the blonde passenger cut through the air. "This is unacceptable. I paid a fortune for this trip and I have an important meeting in London. I can't get there with a headache." A middle-aged executive rose from his seat, clearly irritated. "Listen here, Pemberton. Control your son or we're going to have to take action. Some of us have real business to conduct." Dorothy saw Richard turn red with humiliation and anger. "Action? What kind of action?" He replied, his voice laden with bitter sarcasm. "Are you going to throw my baby out the window?" The tension in first class was becoming toxic. Lucas was crying with such intensity that the other babies on the plane began to cry too, creating a symphony of despair that echoed throughout the aircraft. Dorothy knew exactly what was happening. In her 45 years of caring for children in Manhattan mansions, she had seen this same scene dozens of times. Wealthy families who had all the money in the world but didn't know how to hold a baby properly. Parents who paid fortunes for consultants but never learned that sometimes the simplest solution was the most effective. "Please," she tried again with the flight attendant, "just let me take a look. If I can't calm the baby in 5 minutes, I'll go back to my seat and bother no one else." The employee hesitated for a moment, but before he could respond, the sharp voice of an older woman in first class echoed down the aisle. "What nonsense is this? Why is this person here trying to meddle?" Dorothy felt the blood freeze in her veins. That voice. That pretentious, cruel intonation. She turned slowly and her eyes met those of Margaret Whitmore, the 65-year-old socialite who had been her most despicable employer 15 years earlier. Margaret was impeccably dressed, as always, and for a moment her eyes narrowed as she recognized Dorothy. A malicious smile formed on her Botoxed lips. "Dorothy Washington," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "still trying to meddle where she's not wanted, I see." The silence that followed was awkward. Dorothy stood up straight, but inside she felt the same humiliation she had felt years ago when Margaret had unfairly fired her, accusing her of stealing a piece of jewelry that was later found in the socialite's own daughter's car. "Do you know this woman, Margaret?" asked the blonde passenger with morbid curiosity. "Yes, I do," Margaret replied with ill-concealed contempt. "She used to work for me. A nanny, suitable for certain situations, but certainly nothing that justifies her presence here." Dorothy took a deep breath, remembering the words of her late mother. "Daughter, when small people try to diminish you, it's because they know you are greater than them." She had learned over the years that dignity could not be bought with money and was not lost through humiliation. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," Dorothy said calmly, "I worked for you. And if my memory serves me correctly, I saved little Thomas's life when he choked on a coin that the previous nanny, the one who cost 3 times my salary, didn't know how to remove from his throat." Margaret's face turned red. It was true, and everyone there knew Dorothy was right. But Margaret was not the type to admit mistakes. "Well," she said with a forced laugh, "that was a long time ago. I'm sure this current situation requires professional expertise, not the home remedies of someone of your background." The word background was pronounced as if it were something dirty. Dorothy felt the familiar pang of injustice she had carried all her life, but this time something was different. This time, she wasn't alone in a mansion being humiliated by a vengeful mistress. She was on a plane full of witnesses, and there was a suffering baby she was fully competent to help. Lucas chose this moment to intensify his crying, as if responding to the growing tension around him. His little face was purple with effort, and Dorothy could see that he was beginning to have difficulty breathing between sobs. "Listen," Richard said desperately, no longer caring about protocols or social classes, "I don't care who she is or where she comes from. If anyone can help my son, I authorize it. Now." But Margaret wasn't finished. "Richard, dear, you can't be serious. Letting a stranger from economy class touch your baby? Think of the responsibility, the risks." Dorothy watched the scene with a serenity that only comes from someone who has weathered much worse storms and learned that sometimes the best revenge is not to retaliate, but simply to prove your worth when they least expect it. She knew something that all those privileged passengers did not, that real competence has no color, social class, or address, and she was about to teach them a lesson none of them would ever forget. "Margaret," Richard said with a cutting coldness that made the socialite blink in surprise, "my son has been suffering for 3 hours. If this lady can help him, she has my full authorization." Dorothy watched the moment closely. There was something in Richard's voice that suggested more than paternal despair. There was an authority that would not tolerate further interference. But Margaret was not the type to back down easily. "Richard dear," she insisted with that condescending smile Dorothy knew so well, "you surely can't be thinking of letting a retired economy class nanny touch your heir. Think of what people will say. Think of your reputation." It was exactly the kind of manipulation Margaret always used, turning kindness into weakness, compassion into shame. Dorothy had witnessed this same tactic being used against other employees, other inferiors, who dared to think they had something valuable to offer. "My reputation?" Richard repeated, his voice thick with bitter sarcasm. "Margaret, my reputation is worth nothing if I can't take care of my own child." Lucas had stopped crying for a few seconds, as if sensing the rising tension, but soon started again with even greater intensity. His little face was purple, and Dorothy could see that he was starting to have spasms, clear signs of severe colic that could lead to complications if not treated properly. "Please," a gentle voice interjected. It was Dr. Patricia Chun, an Asian-American pediatrician who was sitting a few rows back and had been observing the whole situation. "I'm a doctor specializing in pediatrics. May I examine the child?" Margaret immediately changed her tone, all smiles and deference. "Oh, of course, doctor." Finally, someone qualified to help. But Dorothy knew something that everyone else was unaware of. As the doctor approached with her professional bag, the woman carefully observed Lucas's symptoms. It wasn't just ordinary colic, it was a specific condition she had seen dozens of times, especially in babies traveling at high altitudes. Dr. Chen examined Lucas competently, checked his temperature, observed his reflexes, tested different positions. "It's definitely colic," she concluded after a few minutes, "but it's a severe variation. I'm going to prescribe some massage techniques and—" "Excuse me, doctor," Dorothy interrupted respectfully, "may I make an observation?" Margaret snorted loudly. Now she's going to question a trained doctor? How dare she? But Dr. Chun, unlike Margaret, was a genuine professional. "Please, speak up. Any observation can be helpful." Dorothy stepped closer and observed Lucas more closely. "See how he arches his back in a specific way, and how his crying has this particular intensity. In my 45 years of caring for children, I've seen this many times. It's altitude colic combined with positional reflux. Regular massage won't solve it." Dr. Chen frowned, clearly intrigued. "Go on." "The baby needs to be positioned at a specific angle, with light but constant pressure on precise points on the abdomen, while receiving a circular massage on the back that helps release trapped gas. It's a technique I learned from old midwives, but it works when conventional methods fail." The doctor processed the information with genuine interest. Margaret, on the other hand, was visibly irritated by the attention Dorothy was receiving. Techniques from ancient midwives? Margaret laughed contemptuously. "How primitive. We're in the 21st century, not a slave hut in the last century." The comment was like a slap in the face. Several people in first class were visibly uncomfortable. Even some passengers who had been hostile before seemed to recognize that Margaret had crossed an unacceptable line. Dorothy took a deep breath but maintained her composure. She had faced racism her entire life, but rarely in such an explicit and cruel form. And never with so many witnesses. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said calmly, "the techniques I have learned come from decades of practical experience caring for children. They are not primitive, they are tested by time and necessity." Richard, who had been shocked by Margaret's comment, stood up abruptly. "Margaret, that was unacceptable. Completely unacceptable." "Oh, please, Richard," Margaret tried to smooth things over, realizing she had gone too far. "I just meant that modern methods are more reliable." "No," he interrupted her firmly. "You know exactly what you said and why you said it. And I will not tolerate that kind of behavior around my son." Dr. Chun, who had remained professionally neutral, made a decision. "Actually," she said, turning to Dorothy, "I would very much like to see this technique you mentioned. As a doctor, I am always interested in methods that work, regardless of their origin." It was the moment Dorothy had been waiting for. Not for revenge or to prove superiority, but to do what she knew best, care for a child who was suffering. "May I try?" she asked Richard, who immediately nodded. With gentle, confident movements, Dorothy picked Lucas up in her arms. Instantly, her demeanor changed. She was no longer the humiliated economy-class passenger, but the experienced caregiver who had soothed hundreds of babies over decades. She positioned Lucas in a specific way, supporting his head at a precise angle while her experienced hand found exactly the right spots on his abdomen. Then she began a circular massage on his back, using pressure and rhythm that seemed almost intuitive. Lucas stopped crying almost immediately. Not gradually, but all at once, as if a switch had been turned off. The silence that followed was almost deafening. "My goodness," Dr. Chen murmured, clearly impressed. "How did you?" "Experience," Dorothy replied simply, continuing the massage as Lucas began to visibly relax in her arms. 45 years of watching babies suffer and learning what really works. Margaret was visibly shaken. Her attempt to humiliate Dorothy had turned into a public demonstration of the lady's exceptional competence. Other passengers watched with genuine admiration as Lucas, finally free of pain, even began to smile. "Amazing," someone murmured. 3 hours of crying and she solved it in 3 minutes. Richard watched Dorothy with an expression that mixed gratitude, admiration, and something deeper. "How can I thank you?" he asked. Dorothy smiled gently, still rocking Lucas. "You don't need to thank me, sir. Just remember that competence and kindness exist everywhere. Sometimes it's just a matter of being willing to see them." That's when Margaret realized she had completely underestimated Dorothy. It wasn't just about calming a baby, it was about dignity, wisdom, and an inner strength that 45 years of prejudice had failed to break. And now, in front of all those first-class passengers, Dorothy had proven something that would make Margaret rethink every cruel word she had ever said. But what no one realized was that Dorothy was just getting started. Beneath that serene calm, she was carefully observing every reaction, every word, every person present. Because those who survive decades of injustice learn one thing: sometimes the best response to contempt is not direct confrontation, but an irrefutable demonstration of value. Dr. Chun watched with fascination as Dorothy continued to massage Lucas, who was now smiling placidly. "Ms. Washington, this technique is extraordinary. Where exactly did you learn this?" Dorothy smiled serenely. "As I said, Doctor, 45 years of experience caring for children teaches you a lot." Margaret, visibly irritated at being ignored, decided to regain control of the situation. "Well, now that the show is over, perhaps we can all return to our seats. I'm sure Dorothy did her best with her home methods." "Home methods," Dorothy repeated softly, still rocking Lucas. It's interesting how some people use that expression. Richard, who couldn't take his eyes off his finally calm son, turned to Dorothy. "Ma'am, I really need to know how to thank you. 3 hours of despair and you solved it in minutes." "Actually," Dorothy said calmly, "Dr. Chun, may I ask a technical question? As a pediatrician, have you heard of Washington syndrome?" Dr. Chun frowned thoughtfully. "Washington syndrome. Yes, it's a condition that affects babies at high altitudes, related to reflux and abdominal spasms. Very specific and difficult to diagnose. Why do you ask?" Dorothy smiled. "Because that's exactly what little Lucas was suffering from. And the technique I used isn't homemade, it's a medical protocol I developed during my career as a specialized neonatal nurse." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Margaret visibly paled. "Neonatal nurse?" Dr. Chen asked, clearly intrigued. "Dorothy Washington," she said calmly, "retired after 40 years at New York National Children's Hospital. Specialist in neonatal intensive care and author of 3 treatment protocols for severe colic in newborns." Richard's eyes widened. "Dorothy Washington. I know that name. Aren't you the nurse who saved Senator Morrison's twins when no doctor could figure out what was wrong?" "Among other cases," Dorothy replied modestly. Dr. Chen nearly dropped her briefcase. "My God. You're the Dorothy Washington. I studied your protocols in medical school. You're a legend in pediatrics." Margaret was growing paler by the second, realizing the magnitude of what she had done. "And Washington syndrome," Dr. Chen continued excitedly, "was named after you because you were the first to identify and treat this specific condition." "Washington syndrome?" Richard asked, confused. "A very rare condition that affects babies during long flights," Dorothy explained. "I developed the treatment protocol after years of studying similar cases. That's why I recognized Lucas's symptoms immediately." Margaret finally found her voice, but it was shaky. You never said you were a doctor." "I'm not a doctor," Dorothy corrected gently. "I'm a nurse. And you're right, I didn't mention my profession because I didn't think it was relevant to calming a suffering baby." Richard was processing everything. "But then when you worked for Margaret." "Oh yes," Dorothy said, her tone still serene but with a slight gleam in her eyes. "I worked for the Whitmore family for 6 months, caring for little Thomas. It was after I retired and was doing some private work." Margaret was visibly distraught. "Dorothy, perhaps I expressed myself poorly." "No, Margaret," Dorothy interrupted gently. "You expressed yourself exactly as you meant to. You called my methods primitive, you referred to slave huts, and you suggested I was unqualified to touch a rich man's baby." Dr. Chun was shocked. "She said that." "In front of all of us," Richard confirmed, his voice laden with growing disapproval. "It was completely unacceptable." Dorothy continued calmly, "What's interesting, Margaret, is that when I worked for you, I tried several times to suggest changes to little Thomas's diet and routine to help with his constant colic. You said you didn't need nanny advice." Margaret was visibly sweating now. I don't remember that." "You do remember," Dorothy said gently but firmly. "Just as you remember accusing me of stealing your diamond bracelet, firing me without notice, and refusing to give me references when I needed to look for another job." Richard was outraged. "She did what?" "The bracelet was found a week later in her daughter's car," Dorothy continued. "But Margaret never publicly retracted the accusation. It was an educational experience about how some people view employees like me." Dr. Chun shook his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable. Dorothy Washington, one of the most respected professionals in pediatrics, being treated that way." Margaret was clearly panicking. "Dorothy, please, that was a long time ago. Maybe I made some misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings," Dorothy repeated, finally handing Lucas back to Richard. "That's an interesting way to describe racism, Margaret." The silence in first class was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Other passengers watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and horror. Richard held his son, who remained calm and smiling. "Margaret, I think you owe Mrs. Washington a very big apology." "An apology doesn't erase 45 years of professional dedication being reduced to stereotypes," Dorothy said calmly. "Nor does it erase the fact that she was willing to let a baby suffer because of her prejudice." Dr. Chun turned to Margaret with obvious contempt. "You almost prevented Dorothy Washington, from using her world-renowned expertise to help a child. Because of what? Pure racial prejudice." Margaret tried one last desperate card. "I didn't know who she was. If she had identified herself properly. Why should I have to prove my worth to help a suffering child?" Dorothy asked, her voice still soft but laden with decades of wounded dignity. "Why should my competence be questioned based on my appearance or the class of my seat?" Richard was visibly embarrassed to have witnessed such injustice. "Ms. Washington, I don't know how to apologize for her behavior." "You don't have to apologize for someone else's behavior," Dorothy replied. "But perhaps you can reflect on how many other competent people are judged by the color of their skin or social background rather than by their knowledge." Margaret realized she had completely lost control of the situation. Her attempt to humiliate an economy-class nanny had turned into a public display of her own prejudice against a globally respected professional. As Dorothy walked back to her seat with her dignity intact, everyone in first class knew they had witnessed something transformative. Margaret Whitmore, the socialite who prided herself on her social standing, had been completely unmasked in front of everyone as exactly what she was, a small, prejudiced woman who had tried to diminish a giant. But what no one realized was that Dorothy had saved the best for last. Because when you survive decades of injustice and become a legend in your profession, you don't need revenge. You just need the opportunity to show who you really are. 3 months after the flight that changed everything, Dorothy Washington was on the main stage of the International Pediatric Conference, receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award for her revolutionary contributions to children's medicine. "It is an honor to receive this recognition," she said into the microphone, her voice echoing through the auditorium packed with the world's top pediatricians. "But I want to dedicate it to all the children who taught me that competence has no color, social origin, or address." In the audience, Dr. Patricia Chen applauded emotionally. She had become Dorothy's mentor in a joint project to train nurses in developing countries, using the very protocols Dorothy had developed. Richard Pemberton was in the front row with Lucas, now a healthy boy of almost 3. After that flight, he had hired Dorothy as a specialist consultant for his medical foundation, paying her fees that reflected her true expertise. "Dorothy!" Lucas shouted from his father's lap, making the audience laugh. The child had developed a special affection for the woman who had saved him on that terrible day. But Margaret Whitmore was not present. After the video of the incident on the plane, discreetly recorded by other passengers, went viral on social media, her social reputation had completely collapsed. The video showed every second of her explicit prejudice, every racist comment, every attempt to prevent a qualified professional from helping a suffering child. Hashtag #MargaGatemore became a worldwide trending topic, symbolizing the deep-rooted prejudice of the elite. Her high society friends quickly abandoned her. Invitations to exclusive events stopped coming. Charitable organizations removed her name from commemorative plaques. The country club she had frequented for decades re-evaluated her membership. "What saddens me most," Margaret had said in a desperate interview to try to restore her image, "is that I never intended to be prejudiced. Perhaps I expressed myself poorly." But the words recorded on video did not lie. There was no way to reinterpret home methods, slave huts, or people of your origin spoken with such contempt. Dorothy, on the other hand, saw her post-retirement career flourish in unimaginable ways. Universities competed for her lectures. Publishers offered million-dollar contracts for her autobiography. The National Children's Hospital created the Dorothy Washington Center for Excellence, a training center that would take her methods to the whole world. "Do you know what I've learned in 72 years?" Dorothy said, concluding her speech at the conference. "True wealth is not in a bank account or a fancy address. It is in the competence you develop, the kindness you choose to practice, and the dignity you maintain even when others try to take it away from you." The ovation was deafening. Renowned pediatricians wept openly. Even professionals who had worked for decades in medicine knew they were witnessing something rare, a woman who had transformed a lifetime of prejudice into wisdom, injustice into purpose. Richard approached after the ceremony, carrying Lucas. "Dorothy, how can I thank you for everything you've done for us?" "You already have," she replied, tickling Lucas, "by teaching your son that human value is not measured by appearances. Dorothy is the best," Lucas declared, hugging her with all the strength of his little arms. Dorothy smiled, remembering that moment on the plane when she decided to get up from economy class to help a suffering child. She wasn't seeking recognition, revenge, or validation. She was just doing what she had always done, using her knowledge to care for those in need. "The best revenge against prejudice," she had said in a recent interview, "is not to hate back. It's to continue being exactly who you are, with such excellence that they can no longer ignore your competence." Margaret Whitmore learned in the most painful way possible that underestimating people based on prejudice not only reveals small-mindedness, but can cost you everything you value most. Dorothy Washington proved that decades of dignity, competence, and kindness always triumph over arrogance and prejudice. Lucas would grow up knowing that heroes exist everywhere, sometimes sitting in the back row of economy class, just waiting for an opportunity to show that human greatness has no fixed address. If this story of overcoming adversity and dignity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories that prove that true class cannot be bought. It is earned through the character we choose to have every day.